Well, hey there, sweet peas. Welcome back to Friendless. I'm your host, James Avramenko, and this week I'm sitting down with the incredible Nicole Thompson. Nicole is a pleasure activist, a therapist, a relationship anarchy expert, and we talk everything from breaking out of purity culture to building community, exploring polyamory, psychedelics, kink, and how learning how to ask for what you want can change your whole goddamn life. It's an incredible interview. You're going to love it. So buckle up, lean back, get comfy, set your volume at a reasonable level, and enjoy my interview with Nicole Thompson here on Friendless. Nicole Thompson, how are you today?
Hello, I am very excited to be here. Yes, very honored.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I mean, hey, this is all you're doing, and I really appreciate that. You know,
hmm
it's nice sometimes when the guest does the work for you. You know, and, and
Absolutely.
they're
I love
just
those. Absolutely. And now
like,
that I'm in your podcast, I get to just relax and you're going to hold the container. It is such a joy when I
exactly.
get to
Yep.
be a guest on a podcast. 'Cause I'm like, cool, you're steering the boat. Like, got this,
Yes. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's
I
nice.
really that's actually one thing I really want to guest more on other shows because I
Yeah,
want exactly that feeling of
it's
like
so
I don't
nice.
want the responsibility, you know?
It's the ultimate sub, right? I get to
Yeah.
just sit back. Where are we going? You got this? Cool,
Exactly,
cool.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll give you my red lights when we need to, you know, right? You know, yeah.
Sounds good.
Um so for listeners who may not be familiar with you, I always like to start off interviews with a very clear and simple question. Nicole, who the hell are you?
Yes, I'm a human being. I think therapists forget that part
Yep.
often, right? So I'm a human being. I would say I'm a pleasure activist who is really passionate about liberating pleasure in our sex and relationships. And there's a whole lifetime of work to be done in that space. I can say very confidently I'm only going to put a dent in it during my short lifetime on this. Truly, truly, I'm going to
Yeah.
put one hell of a dent. And so the ways that I'm doing that are as a psychotherapist who has been trained in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And so I work
Mm,
with clients all the way from, the first initial trauma experiences all the way to reclaiming pleasure. I'm also a queer white relationship anarchist, and that
mm.
is a part of my polyamory and how I move about through the world. And so those are also really important identities. First generation student, parents are Mormon. We can
Ah,
get into that. So I come from purity culture, and that's a big
right.
part of my liberation journey is getting out of purity culture and then getting into the field of psychology and really helping other people in that liberatory journey of reclaiming their pleasure.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I'm so fascinated by, so yeah, this is what's so exciting about talking to you is that
Yeah.
we could go in a million different
I
directions.
know.
And I'm gonna try my best to stay as directioned as possible, but I admit there's gonna be a lot of spider
It's
webs here.
all related.
Uh
It's all
right.
related.
That's just
Relationships
it.
are everywhere.
Well, okay, that's actually, you know what? That I think is a really important thing to kind of start with is
Mhm.
recognizing, and this is something that my therapist is constantly reminded me of, is that, when you're working on your behavior in one direction, you're focused on one thing. Maybe it's how you show up at work or how you show up in an intimate relationship or how you show up for yourself, whatever it might be. There's this instinct to only apply those skills to that area. And then everything else, you're just business as usual, right?
Sure.
you know
Yeah.
and I think remembering that it's like, no, how you talk to yourself is how you end up talking to all humans, and so recognizing
Mhm.
this sort of overlap, right?
Yeah,
And i'm
absolutely.
and I'm wondering, yeah, okay, so with I want to ask more about Mormonism.
Go for it. Go
I'm
for
gonna
it.
start with it because I'm fascinated by it. I wasn't raised in any kind of
Yeah.
religion,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so I'm fascinated by, obviously we don't have to get into the sort of intricacies of it, but what I'm
Mhm.
curious about with you is how did you sort of spark that awakening from being within
Yeah.
this one culture and then sort of breaking through the cracks into this whole new world?
Yes, absolutely. As someone who supports clients in doing this work, it is
Yeah.
slow steps, slow
Yes.
little steps. This has been years in the making, which is why I'm passionate about helping people take less time. I'm like, it's okay.
Right.
I've learned some of the secrets, the codes. Here you go. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that it was a very slow process of following my pleasure and crying a lot along the way,
Yeah.
right? And so I would say that the most important piece of that is finding community, finding people who embody more of the values that you want to move towards, and then slowly taking steps towards that. I always talk about how my sex education, if you even call it that, I wouldn't even call it that. I think that's important, was abstinence only. And
Right.
I got the paper test. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Fun, fun. Yeah. So my sex education, right, is you walk into chapel because chapel is mandatory. I went to a
Of course.
Christian school my whole time, right? And so when I go there, they bring up a blue piece of paper and a pink piece of paper and they put glue on them. And they say that when you have sex, it's like coming together with these two pieces of paper. And then if you leave that person, psh,
Oh,
and
it
then the
ripped.
paper was ripped. Yeah. And they were like, and who's going to want this piece of paper? Now, mind
Wow.
you, I have a purity ring, right? I still wear it now for like reclamation at this point, and there's
Absolutely. Yeah.
stories to that. But um, yeah, at the time, I was like, absolutely. This is why I'm waiting till marriage.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right
Yeah.
now, as a psychotherapist later, I'm like, that is extremely problematic. It is not
Yeah.
trauma informed at
Mhm.
minimum, right? And
Mhm.
so that's really the beginning of my journey and stumbling through so many different lessons, relationships, experiences to really get to the space that I am now to like support other people with not having so much pain through that process.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and especially when you think of, oh God, what one of the elements I find myself really worrying about and really just
Hmm.
feeling a lot of sadness about is the idea of, when that's your baseline of education, when that's your baseline of understanding, whatever that baseline might be, in the context is this, but in whatever facet we're talking about, that's where you remain if you're not challenging those. And so you are creating these sort of adult babies, that are going through the world only experiencing this very infantile, very very juvenile level
Hmm.
of engagement,
Yeah,
and missing out on so much, and that
totally.
that that feels really oh God, there's so many words that could come into place there, but that's just so disappointing. you know
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's I find it to be highly problematic. As a therapist, I'm always walking the edge between cultural humility of
Yes,
respecting a cultural practice
that's right.
and also Dr. Rachel Smith, who was one of my professors when during my training. She also runs these um, purity culture recovery groups and has done a lot of research in it because her dad was a pastor, and so she
Mm.
even got it way more. She we have an episode on my podcast, Modern Anarchy, where she talks about not even knowing that women could masturbate until she was in college and like having no context, right? And
Yeah,
so a lot of her research and work there has found stuff on how like yeah, people who experience purity culture show similar symptoms of people who have experienced childhood sexual assault. They lack
yeah,
understanding of their bodies and in consent. And yeah, even in my own journey after going through a sexual assault, there was this very normalized thing that I've heard now within people who have experienced purity culture of after you have that sort of experience, if you know it wasn't a stranger, and most experiences aren't, this
mhm,
sort of sense of, oh, I need to work it out with this person because I've
yeah,
already had sex with this one person. So now I need to stay. Oof. Right.
yeah,
And so I think, yeah, that's what completely propelled me to go into the field of psychology. And now, like, sitting in that space of, like, what does it mean to be culturally, humble and respectful of
mm,
a specific culture, but also call out some of these highly problematic lack of education. And
yep,
so, man, I'm dancing that line all the time as a
yep.
therapist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
it's a really brave stance, and it's a really tough stance because what I've found in my experience is when you start challenging these beliefs, the first reaction is often anger from these people,
Mm,
right? Is the
yeah.
rejection because they're when you're told something is fundamentally true, and then later on that's pushed against, you're now not only pushing against the idea, but you're pushing against that who that person is, right? And
Yeah.
that's terrifying, right?
Yes.
And I'm curious, how do you go about sort of like advocating those kinds of conversations, or even getting into those kind of conversations? Like, do you find yourself kind of sitting down, find yourself in places where you're actually pushing up against uh, elders in the, or some kind of, leadership role or anything like that? Or is it more about just
Sure.
in sessions?
Sir, I think it depends on the container I'm in, right?
Mm.
Because right now I'm finishing up my last year of my doctorate. So I'm doing community mental health in Indiana, which is a very unique demographic of
Right.
folks, right? And so they're not coming to me to try and challenge purity culture. They might be in it and enjoying it for their own journey, right? And so I'm not even talking about that. And then I have my own clients who specifically come to me. Often they're like, "Hey, I'm Mormon and I got out of it too. Can you help me?" I'm like, "Yes, I can definitely help you." And so then I'm definitely talking about it.
Yeah.
And then when I was in school and the classes, oh gosh, I was definitely talking about it then, because at that point I'm like, I am going into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt because I'm a first gen student. I don't have parents who can pay for that. And if I'm
Yeah.
going to pay for this class, I'm going to fucking push back. Are you
Yeah.
kidding me? And so
Yeah.
the amount of crap I got about psychedelics, about
Yes.
polyamory, you can only imagine. And so I push
Mhm.
back all the time because I'm like, I'm paying for this course. Absolutely not. And so I would say it depends on the container and what the intention is of the space, you know?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that context, because that's a really great reminder too. Is the idea of like how you approach every room has to be within its own context, right?
Absolutely.
I was just having a conversation with somebody the other day about this idea of so much of my frustration around a lot of the sort of online conversations around these things, which I
Hmm.
already kind of tend to avoid as is,
Yeah.
just
For your mental health, yes.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If I can't see the person's face, I probably am gonna at most engage with maybe one comment and then we're done.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Exactly. Same.
right? But then, it comes up mostly in those kinds of environments, but elsewhere as well. Is just these sort of these really really complex issues, these really complex topics that get kind of boiled down into slogans, and just lack any nuance and
Mm.
any kind of understanding of permutations or how it could play out differently, or and and
Yeah.
and I find this has been one of the things that I've been really frustrated with lately. Is the inadvertent kind of sloganizing of very radical ideas and very
Mm.
radical pushback that now is getting distilled down. And I'm curious about your experience within these kinds of conversations. How are you sort of forging your own path through this, and how are you sort of holding your own truth without getting kind of swept away by the tide and the sort of the
Hmm.
mass agreements or things like that?
Yeah, usually I'm just like, hey, you can do what you want to do. I'll just talk about my own life. You know what I mean? You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah.
I'm not here to tell you what to do, but
Mhm.
Lord knows I'll start sharing about my own experience and what I've done. I'm not
Yeah.
here to say where you're supposed to go, but I'll tell you exactly what I did. And if that triggers you, maybe that's something to reflect for yourself. Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean? If that
Mhm.
inspires you, great. I'm not even talking about where you should go, right? Because
Yeah.
um it's frustrating. I've had like guests on the podcast, and I think this is part of just a bit of mononormative culture and an experience where like we will start to talk about expansive relating and polyamory, and then like there's this almost immediate next sentence of "there's nothing wrong with monogamy," and it's like
Right.
no one said that.
Yeah.
I support all
Yeah.
forms. Like
Yeah.
where could you imagine if a queer person was like, "Hey, I'm queer and there's nothing wrong with heterosexuals." It's like, "Whoa, we didn't say that." But this like almost like defense that we have to
Mhm.
do. And so
Mhm.
for myself, I've just realized like, okay, I'm just going to talk about myself. Like, "Hey, you guys
Mhm.
do whatever you want. I'm over here. Burn me at the stake. It's fine. I'm having a good time." You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Sort of,
Yeah.
use the time you get as long as you get it, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So when it comes down, I'd like to start shifting into these questions around sort of polyamory
Sure.
and building relationships, building connections.
Yeah.
It's something that I am, I'm obviously not gonna overshare many personal details. This is a public you know platform, but it's something I'm navigating with a partner of mine, where we're coming back to the system that Jessica Fern developed around the
Yeah, of course.
hearts, right?
Yeah,
The
totally.
hearts, and kind of fleshing out what each of those steps mean for us and our connection.
Mhm. Beautiful.
And yeah, it's really fun. I'm really grateful
Yeah.
for it, you know.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to kind of get your perspective on is, well, there's many things, but the first is the idea of shame. And
Mm,
something that you've touched on already, and I know something you touch on a lot in your work in general, is this idea of expressing your own desires and sort of recognizing your power within that dynamic.
mhm.
And I'm curious, to start us there, uh, where would you recommend kind of going about even just identifying those signs of insecurity or of shame within yourself?
Mm. I think when we get quiet
Mm,
and really tune in to our internal experience, we have longings, we have desires,
mm,
and we will silence them. I think if we slow down enough, we'll have that moment where we're like, oh, I want to say this, but I don't know, and then we pull it back. Start to
mm,
notice those things.
mm,
Feminist psychology would call that the relational paradox. These moments where we fear, if we are our authentic self, that it might threaten a disconnection in the relationship.
right.
And evolutionarily, that is one of the scariest things to happen, is to lose connection. And so
Yeah.
we are battling this experience. But if you deny your authentic self to stay in connection with the person, you actually lose your connection with yourself,
Yeah.
right? And so then for me, I would start to notice this feeling of like, not physical dizziness, but like emotional dizziness, where I would just be like
Mm,
ruminating on these different things and ruminating and ruminating and ruminating, because there were aspects of my life that I was not expressing or that I was sitting in fear with. And so you start to feel that when you feel really down and sad and
yeah.
all these other pieces, because there are parts of your desire and longing that we're not in connection with, even on a big scale, right? Because think of
Yeah.
something like the Sunday scaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, capitalism is not made for all of us. It is made for the people at the top. Okay. So
Yep.
when you're
Yep.
feeling that, God, oh my God, that is a reflection of a desire we all have for a quite different, radical world that it is
Mhm.
hard to imagine in our current structures. Right. And so I think on that big scale, even to the smaller scale, right, of our most close interpersonal relationships, we have that. And so polyamory was definitely one of those things, and especially around sexuality, right? Many
Mm,
of us don't even have the language around sexuality. I think about it like the emotion wheel with therapy, you know, how
mhm,
you start with those big emotions, get out to the more finer ones. Most people, myself included in the past, I was starting to explore in the kink community. This beautiful, curious lover asked me a very simple and easy question: how do you like to be touched? And I had no response.
no, that's when I get up and leave, that's
Okay,
yeah.
so we need a wheel. We need a wheel here. I'm like, I like this kind of pressure in this
Mhm,
area, and I like this, and I like this sort of variation, this sort of speed, right? Like, we
mhm.
have to form the language for that. And the biggest thing that I've learned in my career with psychotherapy is that our relationships form our sense of self. And so,
Mm,
community is so transformative. And so, when you want to get out of shame, you have to change your community. When
mm,
you are in rural Idaho, like one of my clients, and you're struggling to find anybody, that
yeah.
often means finding online communities, other sorts of meetups and stuff, until you can find those people in person.
Mhm.
But it is 100% necessary to find the people with similar values to let down that shame. You cannot do it by yourself.
Yeah, yeah. That's I love that reminder, because that is something that I am constantly, I was about to say trying to find a balance, but my therapist would say it's not about balance, so forget that, But right, but just it's
Sure.
just but just navigating the in between of what work do I want to continue to do with myself, and what work can I not do by myself,
Right.
right?
Right.
And sort of navigating who to bring in, who to ask, how to ask it, right? Those are all questions that I'm, continually practicing, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so the other side of this idea of shame is sort of stepping into, the word you use is your power, right? And I really like that. I like that kind of the idea of just that, literally the empowerment of it, right? It's clear.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what are some steps you can recommend? I know these are sort of generic. It's hard to be
Yeah.
super super specific,
Yeah.
but what are some things someone could try? They've identified their sort of baseline things that they want to work with. maybe they want to ask about some desires. What are some things they can practice to sort of build that confidence to actually speak out and communicate that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, thinking about the community again, finding those people and then also finding receptive people. It is 100% essential that when you are with a lover and you say, I don't want this sort of touch tonight,
Yeah,
that they say, thank you for telling me, and not, why won't you do this? Please, I really want.
yeah.
It is so much harder to be empowered when you have a partner or person who is doing that to you. And so you need to find the wider community as well as the people close to you that will support your no's and your yeses equally, right?
Mm,
And then beyond that, also, if we're talking about internal work, I think there's a lot to do with even something like journaling. I'm really big into narrative therapy because and existential thought. But I think narrative therapy is a bit more digestible to think
sure.
about than existentialism, which is a whole big thing. But meaning making, right? That's the big thing I
Yes,
like about
of course.
existential therapy is meaning making. We're always making meaning of our experience, and we're always
Mhm.
creating stories and narrative. And so the more we can slow down and be conscious to realize, oh, I'm telling myself that I'm the person who is anxious at a party.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you know what? I've grown up to be that person. I'm the first person to pet the animal and the first person to go to like a coloring table and be like,
Yep.
cool, I'm over here. You
Yep.
know what? And also, we can absolutely do challenging things. Could you imagine if my fear of public speaking prevented me from ever starting a podcast? I would just be like,
Yeah.
can't, sorry, it's not who I am. No, I had to
Mhm.
work through that and start to write a new narrative of who I am. We were talking about our podcast and how we evolve and change
Yeah.
and right. And so your narrative of who you are and what the show is has changed. The same thing with
Yeah.
every aspect of our lives. And so you have to start to write new narratives that I am the person who's going to express my desires. I am the
Yeah.
person who is going to tell people how I'm feeling and what I want. And so
Mhm.
that's like the beginning of the work paired with finding good community. And then it just kind of keeps growing. I think it's important to remember that it's a practice and it's a muscle, right? You don't just
Mm.
lift 300 pounds the first day.
Yeah.
It's going to take slow building of that. And then it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think this is why I'm particularly so interested in sexuality because it's so
Mm.
repressed in our culture. We all have a relationship to sexuality. Even if you're asexual, there's still a relationship to sexuality there.
Yeah.
And so no matter who you are, you have that relationship. And given that it's so repressed in our society, the more that you can learn to flex the muscle of actually communicating what you want and don't want, that translates into every area of your life. Once you've
Yeah.
conquered that mountain, it's
Yeah.
like, okay, what's next? Like
Yeah.
it's just really passionate about supporting people in that space specifically.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Also, you're spot on. You just vocalized an experience I had when it's like, if I can be brave enough to ask somebody to paddle me, I can
Yeah,
be pretty much, I could ask my boss for something, right?
exactly. Exactly. And so that's
Yeah.
transformative for
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
And a lot of the work that I did in feminist psychotherapy would also even talk about the voice. I found that
Mhm.
really fascinating
Mhm.
just to think about how, as a feminist, if we look back to the earlier years of women in media, right?
Mhm.
I would be like, "Hi, my name is Nicole and I'm a woman. I'm really happy to be here in
Yeah.
this podcast right now." Versus, "Hey, I orgasm. I feel pleasure in
Yep.
my body and I come hard," right? Like that is a very different breath and
Yes.
embodiment. And so
Yep.
I think that that's also a really big part of this too is the embodiment factor of it all.
Yeah. It is I mean, that first voice feels so disembodied. Like literally, it feels like it's
It's
not
tight.
coming out of a body, right?
Yeah.
It's somewhere
Mhm.
else. One of the sort of temple questions of this show is this idea of what even community is,
Yeah.
right?
I'm ready. I'm
Because it
ready.
can it can mean anything, right? It can mean so many
Mhm.
things to so many people. And I always love kind of opening this section with another one of those, like, it's an easy question to ask, but you can take it any direction you want. To you, what does community mean?
Mm. Are you ready?
Yes.
How nerdy are we gonna get, right?
Oh,
That's the
I mean,
question.
and the best part is we're on a podcast, so like
Yeah,
just
so
let
we
it
can so we
rip.
can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that you asked this question because I was telling you I was just celebrating the 4-year anniversary for
Yeah.
my podcast, Modern Anarchy, and I started my show from a post-it note, right? I was like,
Yeah.
it's on my wall here. I'm looking at it. Uncensored interviews with people who are pushing the boundaries of societal thinking. It's changed a lot since then,
Sure.
right? But I started from this one post-it note, and so I got one of those big post-it note boards, that the bigger ones that you can stick up on a wall and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking up at that right now. And so for my party last month, I asked, "What does community mean to you?" And
Love
so
it.
I had all of my friends and community write it out. And so I was going to read some of their words because I feel like that would be
Please.
beautiful.
Communal
Um,
answers.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. They're all in different handwriting, and I feel like it's really beautiful. It's probably my favorite form of art in my house right now, right? It's priceless. So the words that they wrote were mutuality,
Mm.
care, security, reliability, shared values, reciprocal trust, compassion, ritual, and accountability.
Mm. Ooh.
I
Ah.
know. I was like, I got cool friends in my life.
Right, right? I was gonna say
Yeah.
you got a good circle there,
Yeah, I do.
I like what I love so much about that list is that this circles back to something that I encounter often when asking this question is that it can go in so many directions and it can
Yeah.
encompass so many things, and yet there's this underlying acknowledgement of the intimacy behind it, the need for
Mm,
intimacy, right? And it almost translates into what does intimacy mean to that person, right?
mm-hmm.
Whether they even recognize it or not, right?
Yeah.
The things like ritual, right? I think we don't recognize how many things we do are actually rituals,
Right.
because we just do them regularly, and they've kind of lost that sacred edge,
Mm-hmm.
um that's like something I'm sort of curious about, from your perspective, is sort of how do you find yourself, or do you find yourself kind of making ritual out of some of the more kind of mundane or repetitive things that you do, whether with yourself or with your community?
Yeah, absolutely. I rock climb every Sunday. So
Mm.
that's my time where I like
Yeah.
meet my friends and they come
Mhm.
together, right? And so that's such an important space for me that I go to, even if I have rheumatoid arthritis. There's some days I really can't
Right.
climb at all,
Yeah.
and I'm like, well, I'm still gonna go for community. I go to talk
Yeah.
to people, I go to see other people, and again, relationships form our quality of life and our sense of self. And so these are the
Mhm.
people that see me and are a part of who I am. And so I ask about their life, they ask about mine, and that's such an important ritual. I
Mhm.
think your question of community is important because I, as a queer person, right, I'm a part of the queer community. But when I think about that broadly, I don't really have a like there's no sense of accountability for that word. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
that sense of community is so broad. There are how many of us? I don't even know at this point, or even the polyamorous community or the kink community, the psychedelic community, the therapist community. Those are communities I'm a part of, but
Mhm.
there's not this sense of accountability. And so it's interesting as you get smaller and smaller, like what it means to actually live in community where there's accountability, because that's
Mhm.
a whole different thing when
Yes.
someone doesn't call you out but calls you in to expand more on
Whoa.
something.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
you know, that is something that I have been wrestling with this idea of what I've been toying with it. I haven't quite got the terms, and I'm sure someone much wiser than me has already landed on this somewhere. But
Sure.
I've been thinking of it as sort of like compassionate radical exclusion, and it's this
Mm,
idea of like, for me personally, it's not that I'm like, you're a bad person and I don't want you around. It's that the people who I need in my tight circle are the people who have done certain things with themselves, have certain perspectives, have certain understandings, have curiosities, whatever it might be. That's not to say they all agree with me, but we're all headed in a similar direction, right?
mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things for me personally, when I'm sort of rebuilding my networks and things like that, is not necessarily like swinging the doors open and say everybody come on in, right?
Sure.
It's being a lot more meticulous and a lot more selective of who comes in,
Yeah.
which builds a smaller community, but I find a stronger one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it comes back to what you just said about the idea of accountability, and that's something I think I'd like to hear. I'd love to hear a little bit more on from you about. Um, First of all, sort of from your perspective, what does accountability even mean, and then how do you how do you incorporate that into your sort of how you show up within your community, and how do you want others to incorporate it?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that we're all, again, like I said, human beings. And so
Exactly.
rupture and repair in relationships is inevitable, right? There will
Mhm.
be mistakes. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And so accountability is coming back for that repair moment and to take responsibility. I almost said accountability, so I'll switch out a word, right? Responsibility. That's a
Yep.
word that feels very close to me for
Mhm.
our actions and how we impact people and the ways that we move through the world. I often don't even say I'm polyamorous because I'm more of a really, it's like yes and if I'm speaking to a wider audience, so I don't know where your audience is, so I say like, oh, I'm polyamorous. In
Mhm.
my space I would say like, oh, I'm a relationship anarchist, because I don't even use really that frame. And so I try to bring that level of intentionality to all of my relationships. That's how I
Mm.
see relationship anarchy to be. I did my dissertation on
Mm.
relationship anarchy and published the first research study on it. And I think the biggest frame would be that we all have multiple relationships.
Mhm.
Most of us do not have sex with more than one person, but all of us have multiple relationships. And so that frame shift is radically different. So, yeah, what does it mean to be
Mm.
accountable in all of these different relationships that I have different orbits with?
Mhm.
Oh gosh, I mean, that is a question that I am fundamentally studying for the rest of my life. I think it's
Yeah.
also really fascinating. I went into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to get my doctorate in clinical psychology. I now have this level of privileged awareness of education on psychology and humanness that my mom, who never went to college, doesn't have, that my
Mhm.
none of my family has, that
Yeah.
many of the people that I don't work with have. These are people that are in my community as my clients, and or in my community in my city of Chicago, or in my community as in on this earth that is suffering under climate change, right? Like, so like we're
Yeah.
all in this together.
Yeah.
So like what does it mean to be accountable to that? Oh,
Yeah.
I have no idea how to change that system, right? Because at
Yeah.
some point when I start excluding people, I always believe that people who have not done the work are hurting inside
Yes. Yeah.
and have been hurt by the systems. And so it's like, how do I draw that line to be like, you're not in my circle
Sure.
because you've been hurt by the systems and you're not doing the work, but you are hurting me. And so at some point I do need to have space.
Exactly.
And also, what does restorative justice look like? How do we keep
Mhm.
everybody like
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know. I just make free resources like a podcast. I'm like, it's free. Come listen. I have
Yep.
no idea. I'm trying my best. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, and I think you're scratching at something too, is the idea of, what exactly even is accountability and what is responsibility. And there's these questions. Often I come back to this thought of you can't, like, accountability is actually an internal behavior. It's not external. Even things like, the justice system, which is, fundamentally broken, but or,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it might be, like, that isn't holding someone accountable. That's just punishing someone retroactively, or retrospectively, whatever the correct
Mm-hmm.
word for is,
Sure, I hear you.
but accountability is like a recognition of, oh, I behaved like this and I would like to change that in the future, so I'm going to acknowledge it, right?
Right.
At least that's how I kind of take it, right?
Well, and then we get into complex things like epigenetics, and I'm a preface this with like just some big caution, because we don't know, and I don't want to create narratives are important. The placebo effect is important, so it's important to kind of like caution around this. But
Mhm.
some of the studies with rats and mice, not I'm gonna go mice.
Mhm.
Okay, one of the rodents.
Yep.
Got it. They did this study with cherry blossoms, right? Where they did some classical conditioning, where they would have the stimulus of the cherry blossom and then shock them, give them some sort of pain, negative
Mm.
stimulus. And so they did that for the first generation. They didn't do it for the subsequent generations, and up to 3 generations later, those mice still showed the same reaction of fear to a cherry blossom smell. So now
Wow.
you can ask really deep questions of like, who is responsible for my stuff? Is it 3 generations back? Who's
Yes.
responsible then for them, right? And then all
Yep.
of these bigger systems. And so
Yeah.
that is a deeply complex situation. And then again, the self is formed in relationship. There is no individual self. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we're saying like I need to take accountability for myself, it's like I'm going to do that through relationships.
Exactly.
Obviously there's an internal dialogue, but that internal dialogue is shaped by your relationship. So it's just
Yes. Yeah.
whew,
Yep.
like whoa.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I loved all of that. We
Yeah.
need like 30 more minutes of you just like running, That's
Running, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's what I'm trying to do, figuring it out.
yeah, yeah. But I really appreciate the acceptance that it's like it's not a simple answer. It's not just
No.
one sentence. Well, what you do is this, it's staggeringly complex, and it's something that people will spend their entire lives reconciling with and still not getting
Mhm.
to an answer because there kind of isn't
Mhm.
one, right?
Yeah.
As you said, you just kind of you're human, you just do your best, right? And you see what happens, right?
And then you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like
That's
even
just
the
it.
the language that we're speaking right now was
Mhm,
created by humans who took over the land that I live on, right? And so like
mhm.
all of that is there, and so like I am standing on their shoulders, and I would hope that during my short-lived experience that I'm creating more space for future generations to be
Yeah.
able to run at rates that I don't even comprehend. They
Mhm.
are going to fly up a mountain that I have struggled to earn my muscles for, and I'm so
Yeah.
excited for them. And so
Yeah.
I think that yeah, hopefully we're just using our time to further the betterment of future society, including animals, not just our
Mhm.
humanness, which we are animals, but like the whole planet, right? So
Yeah.
this is all important.
Yeah.
Community, I'm in
Yep.
community with the pigeons that come and take the bird seed out of my bird feeder over
Big
here,
time.
right? So it's all important. And so hopefully just trying to do our best. But I think it's really overwhelming when you, or not, I think it's incredibly overwhelming when we live in such a modern age where you can just see access to any level of human atrocity that is
Yes.
happening right now. And what I frequently see with myself and my community, both clients and my friends, is a level of a trauma response, right? Is like
Mhm.
seeing this and going through the four different ones of freeze, fight, fawn,
Fight. No,
freeze,
fight, flight,
flight.
freeze, fawn,
Yes,
right?
right.
Am I
Freeze, flight, fight, fawn. I
Yeah,
got
there
it.
we go.
I
Yeah.
got it. I got a doctorate. I'm cool. It's somewhere in there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But truly, and so that's
Yes.
like
Yeah.
often what I see, right? And then that deeper question of like, how do we live in all this privilege when there's so much going on in the world? And like,
Yes.
again, so what does it mean to be in community on a global scale? These are
Mhm.
really deep questions that we're all sitting with right now. And I really hope for a revolution in the future because we certainly have enough resources on this planet for the whole world. And so we need some sort of
Mhm.
change on a global scale when 49% of the global wealth is owned by the 1%.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
not an American problem. That's a
That's a
that's a
global
global
problem.
problem.
That's
Yes,
exactly
it
right.
is.
I mean, and something that I've been chewing on. At the time that we're recording this, the Met Gala just happened
Mm,
yesterday, and
sure.
I'm not somebody who like I don't follow that stuff, but photos were popping up, and it just every year it comes around, and I just think, what the fuck is this? Like, what the
Yeah.
fuck is happening? What is this? What is this bizarre, ritual that is happening in the middle of,
Yeah.
as I gesture wildly at,
Yes.
everything else that's happening in the world, right? And
Yes.
how are we? My curiosity is really like, how are people attending that reconciling, attending an event like that while the world is as it is,
Let's interview them. Let's talk.
right?
Let's hear where their
Right?
consciousness is at.
Zendaya, my lines are open,
Yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah, hit us up. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that the reality is that there's so many of us that want change. We want change.
Mm,
We want change. We want change. And also, at least in America, if you don't want to go bankrupt because you had to go to the ER from an emergency situation, had to take an ambulance, then you better show up for your 9 to 5 job if you're lucky 9 to 5, right?
mm,
You better show up for that damn job. And then, you're pretty exhausted at the end of the day and you've got limited time and energy. And so there are so many ways where the system keeps us all in this
yes.
continually and continually. And so it's a really difficult space where so much of us want change. And then also you got to show up for your 40 hours of work,
Yeah.
if you're lucky again under the system that's all you work.
Hmm. Hmm. It's so that does circle me back into, because I I wanted to get us into the Kilk realm and the psychedelic realm
Sure.
soon,
Let's do it.
but
Yeah.
I don't want to like hard pivot into it. So I want to try
You
and
can.
find
Yeah.
a way to get there between what we're talking about.
I can do
Um,
it if you want me to.
but it's this idea of, we're talking about community, and a lot of, what I find in reflection, when I listen back to episodes, when I listen back to just how I sort of instinctively communicate, it
Sure.
often ends up coming across, not always, but when I think when I'm speaking, sort of, yeah, as I say, sort of instinctively, it comes across a little bit like, a one-to-one, or sort of like an individualistic, transaction almost. And I'm more curious on working towards sort of, removing that transactional element, and instead the sort of like, what can a community actually do, that individuals can't. And it's not that everyone in that community does the same thing. It's that they
Right.
hold up different pieces, right? um, and I'm curious, yeah, to sort of start getting towards where I want to go. But before that, sort of, how would you recommend? Because you've talked a lot about finding people and finding communities, and I'm almost thinking the next stage is sort of like, who do you bring in, or how do you sort of like, for lack of a better word, assess people,
Mm,
or how do you recognize the needs you have for that community that you're building?
I think it's an interesting question to pose to therapists who charge money for that, right?
Yeah, 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 and deservedly so. I'll say that. I mean, I'm alive because of my therapist. So like, I'll pay his mortgage anytime I can.
Right. And also, right. So then that goes back to that other question of like, we shouldn't have education be so privileged that you have to take out hundreds of thousands of dollars like
Yes.
myself
Yeah. Yes.
because that drastically changed my community and what I want to bring closer. Because then, as people who don't have certain skills that I've been taught, I
Hmm.
realize that there's ways where then that relationship starts to drain in certain ways. And so then I determine it based on that. But like,
Yeah.
what does it mean at the end of the day that when I look at someone who has a certain amount of skills and go, well, you are actually someone who should be my therapy client and pay me money to come to.
Sure.
Now again, I have student loans, so I got to get out of this, and
Right.
I
Yeah.
do. And so like capitalism isn't going anywhere, and under this system, I got to
Yep.
charge money. Here we are. I've got sliding scale fees. This is what we do, right?
Yep. Yep.
But like ultimately, that's the question you're asking is like, how
Mhm.
do we determine who's in our community versus
Yeah.
not? And at scales of like when a relationship is no longer mutually empowering, right?
Hmm.
And so I do try to think about the ways that even if someone doesn't have the same skills, the same values, like there's like it's not a famous saying, but like that quote that like everyone is your teacher.
Yes. Yeah. Hmm.
What can I learn from this person who has
Hmm.
just as much of a complex existential existence up there as I do? And they've
Yeah.
lived things that I have never walked. And so, like, what can I learn from that person? Right. So, trying to expand that out, but we're also finite beings. And so, you do have to take that space when you are being harmed. And so, I hope you can hear me
Of
answering this
course.
question with a non answer because I too am very bothered by the fact that I went into this school to get to this level and now have this awareness and going, wow, this system's real fucked up.
Hmm.
And I wish that my mom had more education. I wish that my family had more. Like
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
just I wish all people had more. And so
Yeah.
I don't have the answers. This is why I make free educational content.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but to pivot into psychedelics, right? So
Yeah.
you were talking about wanting to go there. The place that I trained at is Sana Healing Collective in Chicago, and they're saying is community is medicine. And so
Mm.
part of a huge piece of my training is that psychedelics are not a silver bullet in
Hmm.
any capacity at
Hmm.
all.
Hmm.
Actually,
Hmm.
psychedelics often are, we talk about them as non-specific amplifiers, and
Hmm.
so it's going to bring up whatever needs to be brought up in that state, and that could be pain, trauma, fear. Some of the most people have extremely difficult times on psychedelics. And back in the 70s there was this big, like, oh, we got to put it in the water,
Yeah.
it's going to liberate all the people. And so what we see now is that when you take a psychedelic and in your circles all hedge fund folks, they say Great. How do we capitalize on this and mass produce this so that we can make thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars?
Yep.
And that is a very different circle than a circle that takes a psychedelic and goes, wow, this has indigenous roots. There are
Hmm.
indigenous communities that use this medicine. We need to make sure we don't take it so much that they don't have access to it. How do we give back?
Mhm.
Those are two different circles, same
Yeah.
drug.
Yeah.
And so then it comes back to that discussion of community that we kind of started with here is like, who's in your circle? The self is formed in relationship.
Hmm. Wow. I mean, it's you're vocalizing things I've observed, like I've observed
Sure.
the way, I never went to Coachella, but
Sure.
I've
Me
but I've,
neither.
right? But I've been aware of it for, 20
Yeah.
years, and I've
Yeah.
seen how it's changed and how Burning Man has changed, and I've seen
Right.
year on year, and then seeing now, hedge fund people, being at the front of Burning Man, and I'm like, what is
Yep.
happening? What is
Yep.
this now?
Yeah.
And yeah, and then they they blast themselves on whatever, and then they go home after the weekend and decide how to, they go right back to, how do I profit off of this? And it's obscene. It
Mhm.
feels, I mean, if, to me
Mhm.
it feels obscene, but
Mhm.
um um the psychedelic realm is something that I'm endlessly fascinated by for a few different directions, in that, so me personally, I'm uh again, without going into crazy detail, I'm sober
Sure.
for, for reasons,
Sure.
and I definitely had my time in the past of abusing, amongst them, psychedelics,
Sure.
and always feeling a little bit of guilt around that,
Mm.
because I've all since I first was exposed to them, I always recognized the sacred element, and the sort of, to come back to the ritual element of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I've been sober almost 2 years now, and
Yeah.
I have been sort of internally kicking the tires of psychedelic
Mm.
therapy.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
And so when you came up, I was like, oh my god, not that I'm like,
Ah.
I get free therapy, but more just like, I want,
Let's talk
more just
about it.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
I just want to hear it, because
Yeah.
I've known people who have done it and had incredible experiences. But I'm curious about, let's start at the beginning, just for the baseline, just for listeners, what exactly is psychedelic therapy, and then let's kind of build out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, oof, there is lots of different ways that this is done,
Sure.
for sure. So, I can talk about like how I do it with the practice that I'm attached to, and
Mhm.
there's lots of different ways. There are people who do it more in a biomedical, you just get the drug and then you walk out of the clinic by yourself.
Oh,
I often get calls from folks who have had bad experiences there going,
yeah,
wow, I had this horrible trip. I was really scared. No one was there to support me. Can I integrate it with you?
yeah,
That's a very different experience, right? And then there are places that do like one off with a therapist. And then there are places that do more of an integration model. So I would say that I've been trained in psychedelic integration therapy. And so
okay.
how we would do that would be like 3 to 4 prep sessions beforehand, establishing the relationship,
Mhm,
preparing you, setting intentions, all of those good educational pieces
mhm,
and rapport pieces with your therapist to create that relationship. Again, non specific amplifier means heightened states of attachment. So if you were
mm,
nervous to tell that therapist something before, you're going to be extra nervous to tell them when you're on the
right.
drug. Got it. Right.
Yeah,
And so it's
yeah.
really important that you don't just like drop into that with no sort of established of a relationship.
Mm,
And then within that, having, say we set up someone with like 3 sessions, it's a full session of you with a therapist in the room for the full hour, and then integration, talk therapy right after, and then a
wow.
full talk session in between the next medicine session, and then repeating that and closing out with an integration of talk sessions as well. I've worked with clients who have had chaotic addiction relationships in the past and have found it to be a radically different experience because it's set up in such a different container.
Mhm, mhm.
And so, yeah, I've even heard of people who have had, specifically right now, ketamine is what is legal
Right, yeah.
within Illinois specifically. And so I've had clients who've had chaotic relationships. That's how I describe it as a therapist, chaotic relationships to ketamine, who have then come to ketamine assisted
Mhm.
therapy and have said, this feels like a completely different drug. And that's
Right.
because the power of set and setting. Again,
Yeah.
it's a non specific amplifier. And so if you are taking that at Coachella or Burning Man and there are hundreds of people around you and you have no one around you and you got lost, that's going to be a very scary experience, and it's going to feel
Yes.
radically different than being with a therapist that you've had 3 to 4 prep sessions with. You're in there,
Yeah.
you've got your eye mask, the blanket is there, there's calm music. Like, this is just,
Yeah.
those are 2 different
Of
experiences.
course. Of
Yeah.
course. I mean, that sounds lovely.
Yeah, it is.
Right? Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you like in as much as you can you walk me through a little bit about like what the sort of experience is like
Mm,
in a session like that, like I guess I have to assume it's probably pretty hard to describe,
sure.
yeah, I'm just sort of curious about how, from your perspective, what you're working through and with, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and there are lots of different ways to do it. The reality
Mm,
is that people also do psychedelics at home. And so I talk
right.
about people who use psychedelics at home from a harm reduction lens
Mm,
because people do die and it's important to talk about that,
yep.
all the way to a pleasure liberation lens. And right. And so we can talk about both those things here. It doesn't have to just be contained to the box of therapy. Within the box of therapy, again, at least at the place that I work at, because lots of different places do it differently. Sauna Healing Collective and Alchemy Community Therapy is where I've trained. And so we guide people to go inwards. And so they'll, put on a eye mask, we'll have a soft music and some playlists, and there will have been a discussion beforehand of an intention. And so
Mm,
maybe that is to unpack trauma. Maybe it's to reconnect with pleasure. Because again,
yeah.
when you are depressed, anxious, all these other things, pleasure can be transformative, right? And
Mm,
so it really depends on the experience. And then again, non-specific amplifier, but the reality is that MDMA is a different drug than ketamine, which is a different drug than psilocybin, right? And so MDMA being that stimulant, you're going to feel so much of your body, right? Where
uh,
ketamine is a dissociative, you can still feel your body, but it feels more like you're in a warm bathtub, right? And so it's
mm,
got a very different feeling compared to all the different drugs. So they are different. Each one's going to be its own
sure.
experience, but ketamine being a full psychedelic, people have visuals, people go to other spaces, people have ego deaths. It really is that
Uh,
full range.
yeah.
And I think what's the most fascinating for me has been to see how it's not about the dose.
Right.
It's not, I
Okay.
mean, there is a certain level of like, you got to get enough of a dose to have an experience. But
Yep.
beyond that, it is about how much you surrender. And so if you are
Mm.
holding on, holding on, holding on, I've had clients who've gotten out and been like, I didn't feel anything. And I like check with my nurse. I'm like, did we? And they're like, yeah, no, we gave him the dose. It's like, okay, we got to check in, So like
Yeah.
just gripping, the gripping. And so the more you
Yeah.
grip, the less you're going to feel. Right. And so trying to relax and really feel that experience. So often that's a lot of the benefit, I think, when someone does an experience like ketamine at Burning Man or Coachella, they're running around experiencing a lot, which is fun,
Mhm.
cool, love
Sure.
it. And when done safely. And also, that is very different than laying in the grass at Coachella and just relaxing, or laying down in the therapy office, right? So you're going to feel more when you really slow down, which is
Yeah.
often the case even in our ordinary state of consciousness, right? When you
Literally.
slow down and try to meditate, you're like,
Yep.
whoa, those thoughts are all over the place, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The moment you stop and like the moment you pause
Yeah.
and you're just like, oh wow, everything is
Exactly.
there, and I was ignoring it all. You know. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so many crossovers. What I find fascinating is the ways that, like I'm going through grad school, right? I am taking 2 years of deep training in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I am writing my dissertation on relationship anarchy and expansive sex and relationships. And I am deconstructing purity culture for myself and exploring
Yeah.
my polyamorous identity. That will create one slew of theories around all of that. And so I wrote a book, The Psychedelic Jealousy Guide, kind of unpacking like for non-monogamy and polyamory, like how to get into the set and setting about that, and the same
Yeah.
things that we do for a challenging trip on a psychedelic like mirror a lot of the stuff that we should be doing when we're experiencing jealousy in any sort of relational dynamic.
Right. Whoa.
I had a
That's
lot of fun with
amazing.
that one.
Amazing. Because you're like,
Yeah.
is it like, oh my god, okay, I'm gonna have to read this book, but I also am like,
Yeah.
it's immediately adding wrinkles to my brain of like, you just nailed something.
Yeah.
In that,
It's
like,
available for free on my website.
oh
Free
my god,
resources. Free
amazing,
resources.
amazing. I love it. But
Yeah.
like, is the stance that you're sort of like you're arguing a type of jealousy with the self, or like what's the sort of like what's the take there?
Yeah, so my take is specifically with polyamory and given the world that we live in with
Mm,
relationships,
mhm.
I would say that polyamory, non-monogamy is a non-specific amplifier of attachment. If you want to
Right.
know how you feel about attachment, take that drug and sit down. Okay? Take
Yeah.
that drug and sit down. Oh my God. When my partner said I just kissed someone, I was literally on the floor
Yeah.
crying. My head was spinning.
Yeah.
Okay? That
Yeah.
feels a lot like a really intense come up of MDMA, where you're just like,
Right.
what? And so, yeah, there is a
Right.
lot there to unpack the
Yeah.
attachment and all these sorts of pieces. And again, the whole thing being about the narratives and the culture that we live in, the set and setting, right? The
Mm,
mindset. What are the narratives about psychedelics going on? What are the narratives about love and connection going on?
mhm.
And then what is the setting? Are you taking the drug at Burning Man? Are you taking it in a therapy office? And the setting for relationships, are you taking it with someone who lies to you, who doesn't tell you the full truth? Well, of course
Mhm.
you're going to be jealous, losing your mind, okay? That
Yeah.
makes sense, right? And so to just get a little bit more curious about some of these contextual factors that are
Mm,
going on, as well as setting intentions for a
mhm.
psychedelic trip. What are your intentions with your partner, your
Yeah.
relationship? What are the values that you want to guide you when you're scared and
Mhm.
you're, when you're in that trip and your heart is racing, you remind yourself, hey, this is just a feeling. This is a moment. It's going to pass. It's the same thing with jealousy, right? And so
Yeah.
there's so many infinite crossovers that I love. And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
yeah.
just this really this bridges really nicely into the sort of the last section that I really wanted to ask a little bit about.
Mhm.
I'm much of the time. I don't want to keep you
You're
hostage
good.
for too long, but
I'm having fun.
okay, okay. Well, then we'll do a medium dive. We'll call it.
I hear you.
The idea of the sort of the psychological benefits of
Mm,
like the BDSM and the kink community. And
sure.
I had a revelation. The first time I got paddled, I was the
Yeah.
most like regulated I had been
I love
in I
that.
don't know how long. Like I was just like, I have ADHD. I take Adderall for, in the morning and stuff,
Sure.
and and that's my very good capitalism pill. It allows me to sit
Sure,
at my
sure.
desk, right?
Totally.
Right?
Yep.
But there was something
Mm.
glorious about just like my body
Yeah.
just suddenly being like, and I'm curious about your experience with the sort of the psychological impact of this, because I think
Mm.
often if people aren't in these worlds, aren't in these communities, their perception is like it's just a leather bar out of the Matrix, and it's just
Yeah.
techno music and whips, right?
Yeah,
And it's like,
totally.
sure, those rooms exist, but
They do
like that's
exist.
not,
I've been there.
right,
And
you
it
know?
can be fun.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
I feel a little aged out of it, but
I hear
it's
you on
right.
that one for sure. It's got to be in the right context. I hear
Right.
you.
But
Totally.
yeah, I'm curious about your sort of perspective on the psychology behind it and the sort of the psychological benefits behind it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's important to name with psychedelics as we transition this conversation from psychedelics to kink and BDSM,
Mhm.
everything has light and dark, right? So you were
Yes,
talking about addiction and chaotic use, right? There's chaotic use of psychedelics, there's chaotic use of BDSM. And so we can
yes,
hold that sort of nuance as we go into
of
all of
course.
this, that it's about consent, it's about embodied enthusiastic consent and conversation, right? And so I want to like table that as an announcement at the beginning of it for
Right.
all people. Beyond that, right, kink and BDSM is so expansive. I think one of the biggest misconceptions for folks is that it's sex.
Hmm.
It's not about sex. It can be a part of it.
Yeah.
That can be a part of your kink and BDSM. But I would say that kink is more about embodiment. It's more about
Mm.
sensuality and play. And so when
Mhm.
you're having that impact scene, it can lead to sex or folks,
Yeah.
we can learn to feel the pleasure of all these states. I think that's really the big goal for all of us, right? Is to
Mhm.
feel more pleasure. And so if you can slow down to feel the pleasure of that impact, are you familiar with The Ethical Slut? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Janet and Dossie, they wrote the books Topping and Bottoming.
Right.
Great
Okay.
books.
Yeah.
Great books on if you want to get more into like DS dynamics and how to do that from more
Right.
of an ethical framework. Highly recommend. And they would talk about having orgasms from flogging. Now, I will name, I have not reached that level of embodiment yet to have an orgasm from a flogger. However, those are some of our leaders in the community, right? And so it's possible. And
Yeah.
so, how do they do that? I would say it's a deep meditation of embodiment. And so, for you to have that impact every time that you do it, it's bringing you back to your body, back to
Mhm.
your body, back to your body.
Mhm.
And so, BDSM and kink, when done in ethical, positive frameworks, right, with accountability, all of those things, it's about that embodiment. So I would imagine for you that that's a lot of your experience, but I'm curious if that resonates for you.
Big time, big time. Yeah, and there was
Yeah.
actually, it's an interesting. I've had a lot of stop starts with my own kind of development, my own exploration of it.
Sure.
I had a partner who we were building a really deep trust with that. We broke up, and there was actually a quite a deep mourning
Mm,
for if I'm being completely honest, not
sure.
necessarily a mourning for the relationship so much as a mourning for the loss of that type of connection, which is really
Yeah.
hard to build and really hard to,
Sure.
it takes a lot of trust. It takes a
Yeah.
lot of time to build that,
Yes.
and to
Absolutely.
have lost that connection meant not just the loss of the relationship but the loss of those other tangential experiences, right?
Totally.
And so it's taken me a long time to rebuild those. I've never been somebody who's been able to, I'm not saying I'm not someone, I in the past haven't been able to just dive into those things, right?
Yeah.
At these certain parties, certain places, things like that.
Sure.
I'm quite envious of my friends who can
Mm,
just kind of like, and I'm like, wow, it must be nice to not be traumatized, you know.
sure. I hear you. I hear
um,
you.
but yeah, at least the experience of itself, the impact itself was massively regulated, and that you're right.
Mm,
It was. I equate it to something like a tattoo or something like that. These ideas that we're
sure.
told,
Yep.
right? We're told they hurt. We're told, oh, it's about pain, and it's like, yeah, there's pain involved, but it's not. It's always tolerable. It's always bearable, and it's also always like it's kinetic. It's about
Hmm.
something beyond pain and pleasure. It's like
Yeah.
I inadvertently start sounding like a Hellraiser character because I start talking about I'm like
It's embodiment,
that's exactly it, right?
sensation.
Exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
learning to not fear or compartmentalize what that emotion
Mm-hmm.
or what that sensation is, and not saying
Yeah.
this is a feeling of pain, this is a feeling of pleasure, but simply saying
Mm-hmm.
this is the feeling,
Yeah.
and whatever that is, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just hoping that people get out of these boxes to
That's
feel a
just
little
it.
bit more able to play, right? That is
Yes.
one of my biggest hopes for people is that they can play more because gosh, if we the word kink, right? Like BDSM being more about the specific letters of that,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Bondage and discipline, sadomasochism, right? Like the whole thing. But kink is this sort of non-normative.
Yes. Exactly.
I remember recording with Dr. Elizabeth Sheff, and she does expert witness testimony for kink cases in court. Whoa, some
Whoa.
fun stories in that episode. Um,
Whoa.
and so we were talking about it, and she had found some research that said between like 70 to 80% of people have BDSM fantasies. We're
Mm.
talking between 70 to 80, that's pretty normal
Yeah.
statistically, right? And so there's
Yep.
just so much that so many of us, it's like, where do we even define that? You have you taken the BDSM test?
Oh yeah, I have,
Yeah, of course. Right, right, right.
I have
Right,
mine
right, right.
screenshotted on my phone. I had
Amazing.
it as my wallpaper for a while.
It's helpful to sound of people, right? Here's
Yeah,
the emotion wheel we talked about. Here's some
yeah,
language. Beep, beep, beep,
exactly. Yep,
beep.
yep.
And so one of the things on there is non-monogamous,
Mm,
right? Like I with where I'm at right now, like I don't find that to be kinky. Like
right. Yeah.
right? Like this is just my normal life at this point. Like
Yes.
this is my
Yeah.
normal commute. Like what do you mean? Oh, I find like monogamy to be kind of kinky at that point because
Right.
it's so far from my circle. Where I'm like, oh, you do. Whoa, like how
Yes.
is that?
Yes.
And so it's like just interesting to think about like where do we define what is kink and what is
Yes.
not.
Mhm.
And I just really hope that people can learn to embody more, to play more. It's fun to play with different roles, and in that you get to activate different parts of the self.
Mhm.
Oh,
Mhm.
what a joy to be able to activate that. And like you were
Yeah.
saying, it takes so much time and care to be able to cultivate safe relationships where you can do that in a loving and caring way.
Mhm.
But also, what sort of expansion of the self? I had wow, so much fun being a sub and exploring all of that.
Yeah.
And then it fucking changed. It fucking changed real fast for me. I went through a woof of a revolution with that because it was an experience where like I was with a dom who couldn't play in any other way because I wanted to be
Nice.
like, oh, like what if I dom you? And it was like,
Yeah.
no, we don't.
Right.
And I was like,
Uh-oh.
whoa, I feel like I'm locked in a box, right? And so it flipped my whole
Exactly.
thing where I was like, I'm taking a step back. I'm not
Mhm,
doing this. I
mhm,
started to be like more dominant myself and get to explore some of those parts because as a woman, that's not often the role. And so I started doing more in that. And now I can come back to it with a very different relationship,
mhm,
right? And so I think even in my own journey, it at first felt so liberatory and
mhm,
then it felt constrictive and
mhm.
then now I'm back, right? Like it's just one of those things where I think the biggest thing about all things in life, your relationships are going to change, your pleasure is going to change, your sexuality is going to change. So start to embrace that big pill because Lord knows sometimes I'm like, damn, this thing used to do it for me. Oh no. Oh no, where is it? Where'd
Yep.
it go? Like that
Yeah.
spark is no longer there. And especially as
Yeah.
someone who comes from purity culture where so much of my stimulus with sexuality was paired with naughtiness, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Forbidden. As I've gotten to a point where polyamory doesn't feel forbidden,
mm.
the threesome doesn't feel like it has that same charge anymore because it's
Yeah.
not like, oh no, like I've talked
Yeah.
about it publicly on my podcast.
Yeah.
My mom listens, like
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
have that charge anymore. And
Yeah.
so it just keeps changing. I feel
Yeah.
like that's the biggest thing I try to talk about is just the inevitability of change with it all.
It's almost like I almost I often see my own behaviors through the sort of like the dopamine chase lens, right?
Sure.
And it's connected, as you're saying, some things that are taboo, things that are titillating, things that are brand new and novel. Suddenly there's a big
Mm-hmm.
dopamine spike, and then you get used
Yep.
to it, and you're like, business as usual, just another Wednesday, right? Bring out the floggers,
Mm-hmm.
okay, right?
Absolutely.
But what I try to find the balance personally is like to not be perpetually chasing that high and
Yeah.
instead kind of finding the middle way between
Mm-hmm.
appreciating novelty and wanting some novelty, but then also really celebrating the things that yeah, maybe this time it wasn't the big butt clencher that I wanted, but
Totally.
it was still a great experience kind of thing, right? And
Right.
just finding that
Right.
satisfaction in the almost like satisfaction in perpetuity or something, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because what does it mean to find like the pleasure in my deep breath right now? Like that's accessible regardless of what play I'm doing, right? And
Mhm,
so like to find pleasure in all of it, I think is a really powerful frame. Of course, we don't want to negate our emotions. It's an important
mhm.
one for me to remember as a
Yeah.
pleasure activist, right? It's like I don't have to be happy all the time. We can embrace the grief. That's important parts because you can't be happy if you don't embrace the grief. It's a catch 22 there.
Yep.
But as you were talking, what I was thinking about is the importance of integration, right? We're talking
Mhm,
about dopamine hits and dopamine, thinking about those big psychedelic journeys, like,
mhm.
whoa, right? The same sort of frameworks absolutely should be applied to our relationships, our kink, our sexuality. When you
Mhm.
have that big, really cool scene, what does it mean to integrate it afterwards, to talk
Yes.
about the people that you had it with, to talk about it in your community? And
Mhm,
that brings up a lot of the joy. One of my
mm.
favorite practices that I have on my website is a form of integration, again for free resources. I have the relationship reflection questions as like an integration practice that I do with my lovers, and I ask these 5 questions. It's like, what are you most grateful for in our relationship? What are some of our most favorite memories from the last month? How have I loved you well? How have I
Mm.
supported you erotically? Right? All these deep questions that bring us to like think about our relationship.
Yeah.
And even though this is someone that I've been with for years, answering those questions is the biggest turn on for me. Every
Yeah.
single time I hear my partner say, like, you're so great, you've done this, and I love how you do that. I'm like, oh my God, please kiss me.
Right?
Like, please come here. Right. And so just thinking about these different like integration practices that we
Yeah.
can do with these scenes, like even a BDSM partner, like, hey, can we talk about how our relationship has evolved? Because
Mhm,
Lord knows it will have evolved over the time that you have played
mhm.
together in any relationship. Right. And so I think if you take that time, there will be a dopamine of a different kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you reminded me of something. I have a friend who, bless their heart, I love them so much, and they're on a journey right now.
Yeah,
They're on
we
a,
all are.
right, and they every time, I don't see them super often. I would say I see them maybe once or twice a month, and every time I see them, they've always got new stories, and
Totally.
and
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
get
yeah.
to and they and I get the impression they're, they obviously they're having a fun time, but they're also having fun telling the stories. And it
Oh
is
yeah.
like it's actually a really pleasurable experience for me because like I'm not in those rooms, I'm not in those experiences, but I get to share with them. And then it also
Hmm.
sparks my creativity and my ideas, right?
Yes.
Um
Yes.
and there is something to be said for like, you were mentioning sort of like, yeah, bringing those stories to the community and sort of not just hiding them in the proverbial closet, for lack of a better, um,
Hmm.
and not just having it for yourself, but having it as a
Yeah.
coming back to the narrative stuff that you were talking about, right? And allowing it to bring in new experiences, whether you were in the room or not, right?
Absolutely. I remember many years back, some of my friends asking me, "What are some of the fantasies you have?"
Hmm.
And I was like, God damn, like I'm in grad school to like graduate. Like I couldn't even tap into an erotic fantasy. I'm like, what do you like to do well on this
Yeah,
test? Like,
yeah. Debt
Jesus, you
free,
know?
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. To
right,
get
yeah,
out, get my
yeah.
student loans, forget Jesus, like yeah. And so I think it's really powerful from, I mean, psychotherapist, pleasure activist, it is essential that we talk about sex within our communities
Yeah,
because trauma, harm thrives in silence. Okay.
yeah.
Great. So we got that end, and then going all the way over to the other side, right? Fantasies, like, absolutely. How incredible to be like, this is the fantasy. And then now to be in such a amazing community that I can be like, do you want to help me make this happen?
Yeah.
I need 4. I need 5.
Yeah.
Can you tap in?
Right.
Like that being a beautiful muscle.
Yes.
And so, yeah, the more you share that, we can learn from it. Even if you're in a monogamous relationship, you can learn from one another and get inspiration from one another. And we are naturally a storytelling community,
Mhm.
from the beginning. This is why
Mhm.
we love movies, why we love books. Like,
Mhm.
this is what it means to be human, is to
Yeah.
like write our story and then share it with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're storytelling monkeys, right? Like that's what we do,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
Nicole, you're incredible. This has been just like
Thank you.
this has
I
just been
appreciate
such
that.
an absolute
Mm,
yeah, this has been incredible talking to you. Thank you so much.
yeah.
I only have kind of one last question for you before we wrap
Mm-hmm.
up. But before we do, yeah, I just I want to say first of all, just thanks again. This has been
Yeah, of
unbelievable.
course.
You're such an inspiration, and I just like
Mm.
I'm gonna go. Yeah, I'm gonna go freebase your
Hell
podcast
yes.
after this.
Do it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. The website has all of the good
yeah,
offerings on there.
absolutely. And to that end, I'm curious, where would you like listeners to find you? Where can I point
Oh,
them?
yeah.
What direction can I point them in?
Yeah, absolutely. Modern Anarchy podcast is available on all all podcast players. So whatever you're on, it's there.
Yeah,
Otherwise, modernanarchypodcast.com is where I have all of my resources, and I have an email list. I send out various insights, things that I'm learning, and yeah, all the free offerings are on there. My
awesome,
book, my dissertation is available for free on there. If you really
amazing.
want to nerd out on 200 pages of relationship anarchy, so all of that is available.
Amazing, amazing. Well, that's
Yeah.
all going to be in the show notes.
Yeah.
So my last question, I always love to leave listeners with like a kind of an actionable thing that they can try out.
Mm.
So I'm curious, what's one thing listeners could try doing this week to try and be a more effective friend, either to themselves or to their community at large?
Masturbate.
Fuck yeah!
You love that? I'm like, that's
Yes,
the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, yeah, you want to really know,
yep,
touch
yep,
yourself and feel good because it's good for
yes.
your nervous system. And if you come out of that going, ah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah, this is good. I feel good in my body. You know what? Then when your friend is saying, "Wow, I had a really shitty day at work," you're like, "Okay, I've got the space. I just had this really great experience, and
Yeah,
so here I can hold this for you." And so thinking
yeah.
about that as a form of self-care, not something that should be shameful at all, but truly
Mm,
a part of one of the most amazing things that our bodies can do to release tension. And so
mm.
please go touch yourself. Please go have pleasure with that. And then please share that pleasure through care and love with other people.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't shy away from
I
it.
love it. I love it. I've also just like I'm just like, oh my god, you've added like I'm gonna have to have you back on. We're just gonna have a
Yeah,
part 2 because I have
anytime.
so many more questions and yeah, this has been incredible, Nicole. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much. I
Yeah.
I don't have like an episode sign off or anything, so I just end up kind of like, well, okay, bye.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I do something very similar. Yeah. So thank you for having me on the podcast.
100%. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode. And thank you to Nicole for coming on, sharing her wisdom. She's just an incredible inspiration, and I feel so lucky that she reached out to be on the show. If you want to learn more about her work, the links are in the show notes of this episode. And while you're there, if you want to stay connected to Friendless, please be sure to sign up for the Substack. It's a great way to stay connected and dive deeper with bonus content, reflections, community conversations, all kinds of fun stuff. You can find the link in the show notes or check out friendlesspod.com for more information. If something in this conversation sparked your interest or just kind of excited your thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment, share the episode with a friend, or let me know what topics you want to hear about in the future. You can email me, friendlesspod@gmail.com, or you can message me on social media, Instagram or TikTok @friendlesspod. But that's going to be it for me this week, so I will leave you with a gentle reminder of Nicole's perfectly actionable advice. Take some time this week to reconnect with yourself. You got a big meeting, you got a stressful something or other, take a couple minutes, J.O., you'll be just fine. Thank you one more time for joining me. I hope to catch you back here next week for another brand new episode. But hey, as always, I'm not going to worry about that now, and neither should you, because that is then, and this is now. So for now, I'll just say I love you, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Fun and safety, sweet peas.